Welcome everybody, and thank you for coming out on this soggy day. My name is Christina Fairvey, and I am the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And I would like to first introduce, again, the series, Buying and Selling States and Markets. A lot of the people here have already heard the spiel, so I won't go into it again. But just this general theme of thinking about economies both during the state socialist period. We heard a couple of lectures already about state socialist economists, ways of thinking about work units that had as much to do with ties with Western economists as they did, and Western German, and in some cases agrarian economists, as with Soviet socialist economists. So today we are delighted to have with us a speaker for the series, Dr. Kelly McMahon, who comes to us from Case Western Reserve University, where she's associate professor in the Department of Political Science and also the director of international studies. And she's one of our own. She graduated from the University of Michigan with a PhD in political science in 2000, and since then has had gigs at Yale and Harvard and numerous other places before becoming professor at Case Western. She has a number of research grants and fellowships and awards to her name, which I won't enumerate now, but I do want to point out her two books. Her 2006 publication, Economic Autonomy and Democracy, Hybrid Regimes in Russia and Kyrgyzstan, and her latest book, which won the Ed A. Hewitt Book Prize for Outstanding Publication on the Political Economy of Russia, Eurasia, or Eastern Europe. It's called Corruption as a Last Resort, Adapting to the Market in Central Asia, which is the title of your talk today. So join me in welcoming Kelly McMahon.
So thank you, Christy, and thanks also to the Center for inviting me to speak today. And just a slight correction to what Christy said, my book was awarded honorable mention. I just didn't want to detract from the person who actually won the award. But anyway, thank you for mentioning that. Also, thank you to Donna Parmalee for organizing my visit here to Ann Arbor. And I look forward to everyone's comments and questions today. I appreciate that you made it out to the talk. So in the course of doing research in post-communist countries for about 15 years, I typically lived with families and had a lot of discussions with them about their experience going through the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it became clear to me that what was really most significant for them was not the increase in political freedoms for people living in many of the countries, but in fact was the collapse of the Soviet welfare state. And this was even more true for people living in countries that had undergone market reform. So both the collapse of the Soviet welfare state coupled with market reform, which is a withdrawal of the state from the economy through policies such as price liberalization, deregulation, and privatization, had really had an impact on people's economic survival. Today I'm going to talk about one way that people in post-Soviet Central Asia in particular have coped with these new economic challenges. And that is by using bribes, personal connections, and promises of political support to gain goods and services from government officials. And I'm going to term this corruption because that's in fact how people in the region refer to these practices in my experience. In telling this story about Central Asia today, I'm also going to present a new framework for understanding corruption and its causes. The main point I want to make is that people consider alternatives to corruption before they choose to engage in a practice like bribery or use of personal connections. So it's not that the absence of legal sanctions against corruption or government officials' demands for bribes or culture propel people into these illicit exchanges. Instead, they look to see whether there are alternatives provided by market actors such as banks, employers, societal actors such as the mosque or secular charities, and also whether extended family can provide help. And if not, then they turn to illicit practices. So really, for them, corruption can be considered a last resort. Also, I'm going to talk about how, somewhat counterintuitively, market reform can actually stymie the ability of market actors such as banks and employers under certain conditions to provide the goods and services that people need. So this is also a story about how people have adapted to the market in Central Asia. My focus on market reform is relevant not only to Central Asia, but globally, because if you think about it, this collection of market reform policies is something that's touched every region of the world for the last 3 decades. So in talking about this new way to think about corruption and specifically market reform's impact, I'm first going to talk about my research question, lay out my argument, the new framework in a bit more detail, provide evidence from Central Asia, and then talk about implications. And as Christy mentioned, this talk is based off of my book, which came out at the end of 2014, and more details can be found in that. So the question I'm asking is, why do ordinary people engage in corruption? So what my focus really is on is what we call petty corruption. Most social scientists have focused on grand corruption, where you have big business people making deals, illicit deals with high-level government officials. And again, what I'm really focusing on is people trying to meet everyday needs, generally interacting with low-level officials. The fact that we've largely ignored petty corruption is problematic because it can be a major coping strategy for people facing economic challenges. Also, petty corruption has negative political implications. It can reduce government legitimacy, lead to greater inequality and economic inefficiencies. So the argument I'm going to make is a causal one, again, about how market reform can actually promote corruption. So my argument is made up of 2 conditions. First of all, the legacy, having a legacy of major state economic intervention. So what I mean by this, you have situations where the state actually has a monopoly on providing goods and services. And so that discourages other potential market actors from offering things like credit programs and things of that sort. Or it can be an outright ban where market actors actually aren't allowed to engage in economic activity or even exist. So this creates a situation of scarcity in the sense that the state is the only one you can get most goods and services from, okay? And then the second part of the argument is the causal factor itself, market reform. And market reform's intention is to scale back the economic role of the state through those policies such as privatization, deregulation, and price liberalization. So as a result, with market reform introduced, you see a decline in the state providing goods and services, so even further increasing scarcity. Now, when the state pulls back, that should allow for market actors such as private banks and entrepreneurs to really flourish. But in fact, what you see is if these actors are coming out of an environment where the state economic intervention has been really extensive, then they don't have any experience. They don't have many resources to get their businesses started, to get banks started, things like that. And this situation is particularly worsened if the second condition holds true, that you don't have effective market-enhancing institutions. So let me explain what market-enhancing institutions are. Those are rules, enforcement mechanisms, and organizations that transmit information, they enforce property rights and contracts, and they manage competition. So they make it easier for businesses to operate, and they help the market to flourish. So 2 examples of market-enhancing institutions. The first would be credit registries or credit bureaus. So those are organizations that collect credit information, information about individuals' credit risk, which is really important because it can expand the number of people who can borrow credit in a country. Another example of a market-enhancing institution are anti-monopoly policies. So they encourage competition, and they can make it easier for businesses to expand. So when you have a situation of a legacy of significant state economic intervention, you introduce market reform, but you don't create effective market-building institutions, you end up with a situation of resource-poor non-state actors. So market actors like banks can't have massive credit programs. Employers can't expand dramatically and hire more people, so people have difficulty getting credit, employment, income. Interestingly, this scenario also affects societal actors, so secular charities, religious organizations, because they rely on donors. So if you aren't having a dramatic expansion of business and a lot of wealthy people, a lot of wealth being created in a country, then you're less likely to have major donors to those societal organizations. Also, globally at least, societal organizations often rely on credit themselves to establish their programs. So a lack of credit opportunities can be a problem for societal organizations as well. A third non-state actor to consider is people's extended family. Okay, so outside of their household, are there affluent people they can turn to? Now, generally we see, especially in the early stages of this process, a lot of people, a growth in poverty. So most people have face severe economic challenges, but you do have some families who are in fact better off. But for most people, in this situation, they don't have market actors to turn to, they don't have societal actors to turn to, and they don't have extended family to turn to. And they also, the formal state programs that they used to know from the past are gone as well. So what they tend to do is they'll go to those state officials and say, you know, I realize that you only have this really small credit program now, or you're not guaranteeing employment anymore, but you know my uncle, or here's a little money, so can you make an exception and help me out? So they in fact engage in what they consider corrupt practices to try to get by economically. The exception would be those this relatively small number of households that have extended family who really became affluent under market reform, and for them they can avoid that step. Even if they can't get help from market actors or societal actors in general, societal organizations, they can avoid the step of going to government officials and engaging in corruption because they can rely on their extended family. So let me describe briefly how this is a really different way of thinking about corruption. So past work in the social sciences has really focused on looking at the state to explain why some countries are more corrupt. So it's thought that states that have, governments that have more responsibility, including even implementing market reform, those government officials have more opportunities to engage in corruption and make demands of people. There's also been the state-focused argument that states that have weak capacity, they can't control their bureaucrats, so those bureaucrats are more likely to engage in corruption. But what these accounts leave out is the other side of the illicit exchange, which is the citizens. So my focus is really on that question of why do ordinary citizens decide to engage in corruption. What's also been left out is looking at those non-state actors, because as I said, citizens think about, well, what can I get from the market, what can I get from societal actors before turning to corrupt practices. Another problem with the existing framework that I've tried to correct in my work is that corruption's really been looked at the country level, but we know even in countries where corruption is pervasive, there's some people that manage to rarely or never engage in corruption. So I was also interested in looking at the individual level and explaining that variation. And the way I do that is with the part of the argument that talks about how the people who have extended family members who have really profited from market reform can avoid the corruption. All right, so now let's turn to the evidence. So I have two types of evidence. First of all, I focused on Central Asia, particularly Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and then as a contrasting case, Uzbekistan. I also did a global, almost global analysis using 92 countries and statistics, and I won't focus on that today. I'll focus instead on the evidence from Central Asia. Now, Central Asia is an interesting place to look at the impact of market reform on people's coping behaviors because the thought was, from some informal observers of the region, that with the state being scaled back and the simultaneous growth of religious organizations, particularly mosques, and also the growth of secular charities, that those societal actors were going to step in and fill the void left by the Soviet welfare state. So in starting my project, I was particularly interested to see to what extent had that happened. Were people, in fact, receiving assistance, for example, from mosques or from secular charities? So if we think about Central Asia in the context of my argument, we know, of course, from historical sources that there was very significant state economic intervention in the Soviet era. The party state owned the means of production, distributed capital, set prices, directed labor, and produced goods and services. And there were also restrictions, additional restrictions on societal organizations. So coming out of that out of the Soviet period, there was a real scarcity of goods and services provided by market and societal actors, and in many ways even a scarcity of the market and societal actors themselves. So in some of the countries, particularly in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, coming out of the Soviet period, in part to deal with the economic problems, but also because of pressures from international lenders, they decided to adopt market reform policies. But of course, this wasn't consistent across the region of Central Asia. And to represent that variation, I have the word market reform in red. So Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan implemented market reform, but Uzbekistan didn't. So in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, you can see a real scaling back of the state's economic role. The employment guarantee from the Soviet era was dropped. State subsidies were significantly reduced. By contrast, in Uzbekistan, particularly in the early independence period up until the early 2000s, the government really made an effort to maintain the welfare state and continue with state employment and subsidies. Now, in all three countries, there was a failure to actively develop market-enhancing institutions, not surprisingly in Uzbekistan, since the country didn't undertake market reform, and frankly, not even that surprising in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, because that early wave of market reform and the policy advice that was coming from the international community was get the state out of the economy, and very little effort or thought was put into the idea, well, it's actually helpful if the state encourages the development of credit registries and makes sure that these enormous monopolies don't exist. So now there's different thinking on this. But back then, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and unfortunately continuing to this day, have put very little effort into developing things like credit bureaus or effective anti-monopoly policies. So the next step of the argument, seeing how this led to resource-poor non-state actors, particularly in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, is evident from the original research I did in the region. So from 1994 to 2009, I conducted 266 interviews with different market actors, so bankers, leading business people, small-time entrepreneurs, also a variety of different societal organizations, so secular charities, mosques, and different groups like that, as well as government officials and average citizens. I also lived in 9 different households in rural and urban areas of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan because I wanted to observe firsthand the economic challenges that people were facing and how they were trying to go about overcoming them. So I wanted to get that firsthand experience. In addition to the field research, I also conducted 3 mass surveys. So in each of the countries, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, I conducted a mass survey of 1,500 respondents, asking them about their economic problems, whom they turned to for assistance, how they interacted with the state. And I shared space on this survey with one of your colleagues, Pauline Jones-Long, who added questions for some different work that she was doing. So together, the field research and the survey research helps to show how resource-poor non-state actors existed in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and encouraged corruption. So let me, sort of in an aggregate fashion, drawing on a variety of the field research, take you through the story using the case of a farmer in Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan. So a farmer in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, particularly an older farmer who had some experience in the Soviet era, would have noticed that the government no longer, the post-Soviet government, no longer guaranteed purchase of the commodity which historically he or she would have produced on the state or collective farm, but now was trying to do independently. So no guaranteed purchases, no subsidized or free inputs of seed, fuel, fertilizer, nearly all of that had stopped. The farmer would have witnessed a significant scaling back of the state's role in the economy, in this case agriculture. So the farmer may go to the local government offices and find that a small credit program is offered, okay? And typically what you find in terms of these credit programs is you'll have like 100 applicants for 5 spots, okay? So really, really competitive to get the little bit of state goods and services that are still provided, in this case, to help one expand one's business, okay? And go beyond sort of just subsistence farming. So that would be discouraging for the farmer. So then he or she may turn to a market actor, such as a bank, and find that, particularly as a rural resident, he or she does not have significant collateral for a private bank to be willing to lend. You know, that old Soviet tractor really isn't worth much to the bank, and if the farmer were to default, it would be really hard for the bank to realize to sell that tractor and get anything for it. So the bank's not going to lend to the farmer unless the farmer, you know, happens to have an apartment in Almaty or Bishkek that can be put up for collateral. But that's really rare. Or if the farmer happens to have a non-agricultural job on the side, like a successful import-export business or something. But that's really rare in, you know, your average Kazakh or Kyrgyz village. So the banker can't be of any help to the farmer. So then the farmer turns to a local societal organization, and in most villages that's going to be a mosque. And the farmer will approach the imam and ask what possibilities there are. You know, not that the farmer would know this, but we know, for example, in the Middle East, the religious community provides extensive job training, credit programs, things like that. Well, it's very different in Central Asia. In most places in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, the imam will report, you know, maybe he gets 3 bags of flour during each of the major holidays as a donation. I mean, that's the only resources he has to work with. So the imam is not running, you know, a credit program or job training or anything like that. So the mosque is of no financial help to the farmer. So then the farmer turns to his or her extended family. Now, if that, let's say that uncle happens to be someone who really profited from market reform, then the uncle will say, you know, no problem. I'll give you some credit. You know, go ahead and buy some more land so you can get beyond subsistence farming, or go ahead and purchase that equipment so you can turn your wheat into macaroni and get more of a profit and continue to grow your business. but most people don't have that relative. So in most cases, the relative says, sorry, I can't help you either. I'm struggling just as much. So then the individual turns to officials. So I heard directly from officials who were running those very small, very competitive government credit programs that they were repeatedly offered bribes, or people would try to use connections. So, you know, just change my data on the application so that I'm eligible for this program. We'll just pretend I have, you know, a non-agricultural business on the side. I'll give you a little money if you're willing to do that. Also, I heard from farmers that they would drive to other villages where they had connections to try to get exceptions made to the credit programs offered through those district level, rayon level governments, for example. Now you may wonder, I mentioned that some people are able to avoid corruption because their relatives, they have an extended family member who did well in the market reform era. So one other thing I looked at was, how is it that some people did so well? You know, were they themselves engaged in corruption? What did they do to become successful? And it seems what was most important is they left their formal employment in the Soviet era. They started their businesses really early. They took advantage of opportunities before anyone else did, like in terms of buying and selling, that type of thing, and started to accumulate capital very early on. A lot of them, the most successful entrepreneurs I interviewed were former Komsomol leaders, so they were comfortable with leadership positions and maybe even some risk taking. Some of them were also leaders at their places of employment, like being a mining director or something. Not that they necessarily benefited in terms of resources from their place of employment, but they had some financial experience and some ideas about credit and taking risk and things like that. Whether or not they engaged in corruption, I only found one entrepreneur who was clearly blackmailing city officials to help his business go better. But otherwise, you know, there weren't very clear-cut laws in the Soviet era, late Soviet era or early independence period, nor were there very clear-cut norms. So it's a little bit hard to judge whether, you know, taking advantage of an opportunity was corruption. But the key factors seem to be starting the business early, taking that risk early, and having some leadership experience. So there are people out there who can break that cycle of corruption for some people who are facing economic challenges, but the numbers are pretty low. Okay. So the survey provides useful corroborating evidence for this account. From the field research, I was really able to work out the causal story, but I also wanted an idea of how widespread this was. I didn't know if this was just among, you know, the families and people and villages where I had been. So in this survey, I first asked people, one of the early questions was I asked them just to tell me what their everyday problems were and to give me like the top 3 everyday problems. And here's where the contrast with Uzbekistan, the country that didn't undergo market reform, comes in. So you can, in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, to generally categorize the types of problems people were facing, it was lack of income. Okay, so they lost their job, or their salary was too low, or they weren't being paid salary, or they couldn't get credit to expand their businesses. Okay, so lack of money. Whereas in Uzbekistan, it was a really diverse list. Like my biggest problem is there's a conflict in my family. My cows have foot and mouth disease. So it's just really, really wide range of problems. And the problems in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, you can go back and trace them directly to what happened, because you can trace them directly to the market reform policies. They're really close links. So that's evidence in itself of this impact of market reform. Next question I asked people was to whom they turned to for assistance. And about 20% of people in all 3 countries turned to government officials. Now, in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, they're trying to deal with this lack of money problem. In Uzbekistan, it's a range of different problems. Across all 3 countries, very few people turn to societal or market actors. So fewer than 5% turn to any particular societal or market actor. So the data for Uzbekistan is comparable, but I'm really interested in focusing on the market reformers here. So you'll see that, you know, these are percentages of the respondents in each country. So you'll see that really small, this means that really small numbers are turning to these market or societal actors, whereas roughly 20% still turn to government officials. So the other thing I was interested in is if they're turning to government officials, and I have a good sense from the field research of in what sense, how they're turning to government officials, what practices they're trying to use, like bribery and personal connections, and to a lesser extent promises of political support. I was still interested in trying to capture this somehow in the survey, but I didn't want to ask directly, do you engage in corruption? So I asked, because we found that hasn't always been a very effective approach. So I asked instead for people in the 3 countries to characterize how citizens interact with the state. And there are basically like a bunch of different models in political science. So I wanted to see, you know, what could they do with those. I described in very simple terms. And what I found was a difference in Uzbekistan compared to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. So in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, most respondents indicated that people in their country engage with the state in the sense of competing for state goods and services. So their interaction with the state, it's a competition, it's a free-for-all, okay? So you can see how they would try to get a leg up by using a bribe or a personal connection to try to get a leg up, an advantage in that competition. That was less so the case in Uzbekistan. And the most popular response in Uzbekistan was people's interaction with the state was just receiving goods and services. So very much more of an old Soviet era, I'll just be provided for by the state, not that I'm competing with fellow citizens. So I think that provides some corroborating evidence for the causal story I found as well. So it does seem to suggest that market reform under the conditions of a significant state economic legacy and the weakness or absence of market-enhancing institutions has promoted corruption in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. And I was interested, though, to see if this relationship extended beyond the region. So as I mentioned, and I'll just describe very briefly, I also examined I tested the argument statistically in 92 countries of the world, and I just wanted to point out that once you leave the Central Asian region, you get variation on everything, right? So when I was just looking at the Central Asian countries, there was only variation in terms of market reform. I had some market reformers, some non-market reformers. But once you go out into the world, you also have variation in terms of to what extent there was a legacy of significant state economic intervention. And some variation, not an enormous amount, but some variation in terms of to what extent market-building institutions were developed along with market reform implementation. So the global analysis also provides some support for the argument. So the project as a whole sheds a lot of light on how people are coping with the economic challenges they face in Central Asia, particularly in the early independence period into the early 2000s, which is when my research took place. It also offers important practical and theoretical implications. So in terms of anti-corruption efforts, what my findings suggest is that it's not sufficient just to tinker with state institutions. You can't just increase government officials' income, for example, or create more sanctions for bad behavior. You also need to look at citizens' decision-making and whether they're approaching government officials and suggesting illicit exchanges. And more broadly, you need to ask whether there are alternatives in a society, in a country, so that citizens don't have to engage in corruption. And if they're not, then efforts need to be made to boost those market and societal alternatives to dealing with economic challenges. In terms of theory, in terms of understanding of corruption, it suggests that both to reduce and understand corruption, we need to move away from this idea that state institutions and culture propel people ordinary citizens into corrupt exchanges, instead consider their decision-making process more carefully, and also the alternatives that are available to them. So thank you very much for listening. I look forward to your comments and questions now, and also feel free to continue the discussion by email after today, too.
Do you speak those languages?
I did my research in Russian, so I was proficient in Russian. I actually studied Uzbek here, and then when I was doing postdoctoral research at Harvard, and so when I was working in southern Kyrgyzstan, I tried to use Uzbek, especially with government officials. I know in advance what their names were, so I could figure out whether they were ethnically Uzbek. And so I would do introductions in Uzbek and thought this is a great way to warm them up and show respect for their culture. It freaked them out. Speaking Russian decently was bad enough because, in different places in rural areas I'd get accused of, being a spy. But to speak, their kitchen table language was just completely bizarre for them. So, at least for the government officials. So I ended up actually even abandoning that. So I did interviews in Russian. The survey respondents had the option of, it was in face-to-face interviews, and respondents had the option to answer, to be surveyed in Russian, Kyrgyz, Kazakh, or Uzbek. We did those languages. And for that, I relied on a team of people in Central Asia to both help with the translation of the survey questionnaire and the administration.
Thank you for a really marvelous talk. I wanted to talk a little bit more about, the elephant in the room is what the resources were to begin with. I know Pauline's done work on the oil industry and how that has been structured really differently in these countries, and how oil gets oil products get redistributed is a big part of how the state formation happens. Whatever. So, what kind of resources does the state have and lose, and how does that play into whether they have what they have to give out? How does Uzbekistan still have so much?
Yeah, I think for Uzbekistan in particular, the story's changed, and I would actually expect to see a growth in petty corruption. I haven't done field research there, so at this point I don't know what's going on, and I haven't repeated the survey. But because of the government's economic crisis there, there's definitely been a scaling back of the state's role in the economy. So we know that there have been increasing complaints of by people of not receiving their state salaries. Energy subsidies have been really cut back. So I would expect to see, not because of market reform, but more generally because of the scaling back of the state, without a really rich environment of resource-rich market and societal actors, that we would see a growth. We probably have seen in the last 5 years or so a growth in petty corruption in Uzbekistan too. In terms of the state's resources, one thing to keep in mind, because one reaction to this can also be, well, these are poor governments too. But still, compared to the average farmer who just needs a small amount of money to buy that macaroni making machine, the state's a resource-rich actor, right? But you do see variation, obviously, particularly before the currency devaluation and the drop in oil prices in Kazakhstan. The government had quite a bit to work with. And we have seen there more of a welfare state. So the pension reform's been pretty successful in Kazakhstan, so retirees are better off there. But even so, you go to rural villages in Kazakhstan, and people are struggling in much the same way that they are have been in Kyrgyzstan, for example. One interesting thing about oil that I looked into, and just natural resources in general, was another actor, a market actor, I considered was foreign companies. So to what extent do foreign companies stepped in for the state and be providing goods and services? And Pauline and her co-author Erica Weinthal had briefly mentioned this in some of their work. So I did some research on this, which was really interesting for me. And these foreign businesses that come in and buy up mines in Kazakhstan, for example, they do provide a lot of services, especially to their employees. So if you're an employee, like your problems are pretty much solved, right? And then they also provide a lot of services in that particular location, goods and services, and it's kind of a it's a trade-off, though, because while as a resident but non-employee of that locale, so my children may have, a free school lunch now because they go to the town school and the foreign business is providing it. If I could never get a larger apartment because property values have skyrocketed. So for non-employees, it's not clear how much things have improved. But the bigger point is that's really limited geographically, right? Whereas like the Soviet state did a pretty good job of covering the territory, these foreign companies are just located in certain places, so they're not replacing the state in any way. But yeah, it's interesting to see what they have done. Luciana?
I was wondering, actually, if people have, if they see differently institutions that have been privatized but historically have been part of the state. So in socialist regimes, so such as banks or, employment agencies or even schools. And I'm wondering this because I'm wondering if people see themselves engaging in a different kind of exchange with people who are at the bank or a school now. So if I go to a friend who has a so-called private school now, and get a spot for my child, is it different than bribing somebody in the socialist state? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So in terms of my research, I really only looked at corruption, those practices in the context of an interaction with a government official. So I just decided to exclude, bribing for admission to a private university or something like that.
Or the bank to get a credit as well. If the bank is not owned by the state anymore, then is it still corruption if it's a private bank?
It wasn't something I focused on, but maybe I can speak more broadly about, because one reaction to this can also be, well, you're just suggesting that the private sector take over, but there can be corruption in the private sector too, which is true. I think what's different, there are a couple things that are different. So if you're offering the bribe to the banker, right? So in most cases, you'll probably have more market or societal actors to choose from. Assuming, in this country, everybody became, had some resources to share, right? So I could choose from among 5 banks, and if one I heard that you only can get credit through a bribe, well, then I have another 4 to choose from, right? Whereas, if I live in a, well, in that case, I would have to live in a city, there's only one government credit program, right? So I think it's different in that way. Because people have more choice and can still work to try to avoid corrupt exchanges in the private sector because there's multiple private actors. The other thing that's different is it doesn't have the negative political implications. Like, yeah, it's really sad if the only way I can get credit is by bribing a bank official, but it doesn't have the direct implications for regime legitimacy, for example. So I don't know if that was good enough. Okay. Yeah, Doug?
Central Asia in the post-Soviet certainly at a sort of macro level, but there's any number of people who have looked from any number of perspectives, economic or historical or political, about all the complicated things that happen around the edges of the supposedly controlled Soviet economic space where everything's planned, everything's good, right? There are all kinds of strategies, and many of those came to be called and thought about and discussed and denounced as corrupt.
Right.
And a bunch of those happen specifically in Central Asia. So in particular, I'm thinking of just one example, the cotton skin.
Right.
That's the obvious one to
Yeah.
go to, right? Where across the Soviet Union, citizens see that Central Asians as, by definition, corrupt. You know, the East, don't they? Just don't understand if you're there. So that means you have this kind of corrupt outcomes without any of the variables that you were tracking through, whether market, institutions, or non-market bases, or all the kinds of things you're trying to do. It seems to complicate things. So how are you kind of seeing the kind of corrupt practices you're seeing as specifically a product of this moment of market reform or not, relative to the pre-existing and ongoing legacies of understandings of corruption that are a really important part of Central Asia?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So first of all, just to clarify, the argument I make about market reform under the two conditions, that's clearly not the only source of petty corruption out there, right? So there are other factors that can cause petty corruption. But I do think it distinguishes among the Central Asian countries I was looking at. But another reaction to this can be, well, this is just a holdover from the Soviet era, right? Because as Doug said, there clearly was corruption in the Soviet era, and there clearly were economic challenges that people faced, particularly in the late Soviet era. So how do we know that these practices aren't just a holdover? So I got at this in the field research, but I also asked about this I tried to get at this in the survey data too. I'll pull this out because I have my numbers. So I asked before 1991, whom did you rely on for assistance? So to see if there had been any change. And of the people who, so if I look at the people who are seeking help today, okay, in the contemporary period, around 80% in each country, almost 90%, didn't turn to government officials in the Soviet era, okay? So they've had some change in practice, okay? So those bureaucrats who managed to stay in office, you know, in some, or a newly named office in some rayon or village or something, they weren't turning to them in the Soviet era. And in a way that's not surprising because there has been a restructuring, right? So in the Soviet era, people turned to their place of employment was really common. Not surprising, right? The state enterprises, your place of employment gave out the benefits. If you needed more assistance, then you would go there. They also would turn to the unions. Again, unions provided benefits in the Soviet era. So this was true in both Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. So percentages around 20% was what they percentage of people who were doing that for the Soviet era. Whereas turning to a government official, only 7% did that in the Soviet era. And now the numbers are very different, right? The unions, they're not helpful at all. Places of employment aren't helpful at all. The 20% who are out there seeking assistance are going to the government officials. So there's been a shift in to whom you turn to for assistance. So it's not a story of just a continuation of Soviet practices. The other thing is, if you look at what people are trying to obtain, in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, they're trying to obtain money, credit, and employment. Well, that's not what you used corruption for in the Soviet era, right? We know that. You were trying to get you know, the better doctor at the hospital, the better position at the university or into a better university, that type of thing. So there was more of an emphasis on getting higher quality goods and services through corrupt practices in the Soviet era, I would say, whereas now it's not an issue of quality, it's an issue in these market reformer countries that have undergone market reform, of getting sufficient funds to be able to purchase the goods and services. So I think there's definitely been a break from the Soviet era. So I think that's, and there's a difference among the three countries, because you've got to remember, Uzbekistan had that Soviet history too, but it looks different now.
Well, Turkmenistan and Tajikistan did come to things, also from the state capacity countries. But before I that in a way goes back to Christie's opening
Yeah.
earlier question about what the resources are that are actually available there. So in the There'd be no point to kind of persisting with that organizational template from the Soviet period. The question is, the argument is about people going to corrupt practices of these informal connections as a last resort. And so that's really the question. Like in the Soviet period, there still are these kind of practices that have unions or their employers that kind of pull on personal connections to go outside the processes in order to get what they want. And in the post-Soviet period, they're doing the same sorts of things where you're contending, after trying to things, which is a separate question. But at some level, isn't it the same kind of set of practices that are happening just where the resources are in the context of needs that are historically developing?
Right. So, I mean, you can abstract up to a level of corruption is caused by people needing things, and they go where the resources are, right? So, yeah, so in that sense, the Soviet and post-Soviet eras are the same. But why do we see the difference? Why have we seen a difference in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan versus Uzbekistan? They both went through that Soviet experience. So, and that's where it looks like market reform is what the influence is. And it's not just a story for Central Asia, but also looking at market reform and market reform advice globally, too, and how that should be done. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question about the very term of corruption itself.
Uh-huh.
I just wanted to ask if you think it's a really helpful term to sort of take as a sort of main sort of lens for a analysis or any analysis of these sort of informal practices of exchange. I think there's always the danger that we bring in a certain moralizing tone into the discussion, especially when we call things bad, illicit, or petty. By whose standards and why? I mean, of course by our Western standards, but I just wonder how useful it is to sort of impose these categories that we bring in, sort of looking back at a longer Western sort of neoliberal tradition of economic life, and we then try to sort of analyze and understand what is going on in a different area of the world that does not have the same tradition. So, I mean, what you're talking about is very much the case in Eastern Europe too, in many ways. And as Doug also said, there are continuities from the pre-89 period that also reach far back. Well, who knows how many centuries, probably. So my question is really, is the term corruption really helpful, or is it maybe more helpful to really talk about sort of network of trust, of friendship, of patronage, of clientelism, that sort of allow us to really understand these things as not bad, because I don't think there's anything bad about these things, or really sort of morally questionable. It's just a different type of organizing economic life, organizing relationships, social relationships, sort of tinkering an individual's relationship to the state. So that's one thing that I wanted to ask you, sort of the big question about corruption itself. I think there's a lot. It's a very fraught concept, and it's very loaded with all sorts of implications that I think need to be at least addressed. And the second question is, you said at the beginning that your interlocutors also sort of understand themselves and their practices as being corrupt. And to me, this also hints at least the possibility that it's become kind of an internalized identity category for these people, precisely because after '89, the big sort of remaking of the economic landscape in post-socialist countries was all about sort of introducing more rationalized, more non-corrupt practices. And I wonder to what degree people in these societies have internalized this idea themselves, because it's been brought into these countries as this reformist, as this sort of more modern, more capitalist way of organizing economic life. Yeah, that's basically it.
Okay, thanks for your questions. I'll take the second one first. So so obviously the term corruption existed in the Soviet era too, so it wasn't unfamiliar prior to the flood of Western nonprofits and international organizations and advisors coming in with neoliberal ideas. I didn't explore where the language came from, and that would be a really interesting project in itself, but that wasn't my focus. So I don't know. I don't know if people's comfort and sort of at their own initiative using the word corruption, where that originated from. That wasn't something I studied. I originally was thinking of this as a project in terms of just coping strategies. And I thought, well, maybe I would in fact find out that, mosques had created extensive credit programs and they had really, replaced the state. And then I found out what the practices were. And as I'm talking to people, they're referring to them as corruption. I don't make a normative judgment in the book. I'm very clear that, and I tried to say that at the beginning too, I'm using this term because that's what the people there used. In terms of scholarship, though, you need to connect your work to the existing body of work too. And my findings seem to say the most about corruption and also the impact of market reform on corruption. So I think the fact that people in the region termed it corruption, and then also comparatively similar practices in other cultures are termed corruption too, makes it justifiable to do that. I also had certain things I wanted to study, and I didn't want to study the meaning of the terms themselves. That would be a valuable project in its own, but I also wanted to come up with the terms, the definitions, and move on to see how things interact. So that was my motivation too, if that makes sense. Okay. Kiro?
Yes, Kelly, thank you for a great presentation. The only question I got is about social desirability bias. So corruption is a socially desirable kind of phenomenon, so it's very sensitive kind of question to ask of respondents. So there is a expectation that in the states with the market reform, respondents would be more inclined to give less socially desirable answers. So they would be kind of more honestly, sincerely answering the question. As opposed to the, to Uzbekistan, for instance, right? Where there was no market reform taking place, and so people would be providing more socially desirable answers to your question. So is there is a kind of, like alternative explanation to your general concept? I really like the way you explain things, but I think that social desirability would step in.
I think social desirability would actually work in the opposite direction, because the market reform rhetoric is, don't turn to the state. You're responsible for yourself. If you need any help at all, go to the bank, build your business. So in the market reform countries, I think people would be more hesitant to say that they were turning to the state for assistance. Whereas in Uzbekistan, if you look at Karimov's his writings, he talks about continuing to provide for the people, and the state has that responsibility. And so I think it actually works in the other direction. Also, just in social desirability in general, so for this survey, I was obviously very removed for that. But for especially the initial interviews I did, I was going back to, for this project, I was often talking to people who I lived with periodically, like over a 10-year period, those household studies. Sorry, not periodically over 10 years, not all 10 years I was living there. But anyway, so I think because of that, because I was very well known, that people were being honest with me in the field research, and then also I would just observe things too that they hadn't planned. Someone would, one family I lived with, someone showed up one day and offered their son to marry the daughter of the family I was living with, and then after he said that, he said, and then could your son, the brother of the potential bride, could your son, who was head of one of the government agencies most known for corruption, get my son a job? So, that I just saw. That wasn't planned, and I was just there at the kitchen table listening to it all. So yeah, so I think I thought a lot about that, because not so much for market reform, but for corruption, there's a lot of issues with social desirable answers. Yeah, thank you. Scott.
Yeah, a real question and a fake one.
Okay.
The real question is, did you see, for example, ethnic strategies of coping mattering? Like, do Russians and Kazakhs in Kazakhstan behave differently? And the fake question is, fat-headed World Bank types haven't had a look in yet. But if I were an adherent to that kind of click-guard thesis, that corruption is the sum of discretion and monopoly, I'd say all we need to do is get some microcredit going here and reduce the discretion of local employees even more, and we'd be addressing the problem. What would you say to me were I that person?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll take the second question first. So that would be along the lines, yeah, so this idea of if you reduce government officials' discretion, or reduce government officials' responsibilities, then they'll have fewer opportunities to engage in corruption. So just take the credit programs away from them. The problem is you can't just focus exclusively on the government officials. You need to focus on the other side of the exchange too, because I think citizens will continue to try a variety of different ways to get resources from the state. Even if there's not the official credit program, then the state still has resources that aren't even attached to the official program that citizens could try to get. So I think what I advocate is continuing anti-corruption efforts that focus on government officials' behavior, but at the same time focus on citizens' behavior, and more specifically make sure that there are alternatives to engaging in corruption. So build up those market and societal alternatives. So that would be my answer to that person. And then in terms of ethnicity, so the personal connections that I mentioned, those are one of the three practices I looked at, and that's used really widely, connections. And it's not, ethnicity plays a role, but you can also be connected to people in other ways. So there's ethnicity and clan, but then there is also military service ties are important. And school ties are important too, and hometown ties are important too, but hometown will often overlap with your ethnicity or clan. So a bit of evidence from this, so I heard a lot about this in the field research, examples from Russians who were excluded because they weren't of the titular ethnicity. But beyond the field research, also I saw that titular minorities were much more likely to seek state assistance than the non-titular groups. And keep in mind that there's been a wave of the members of the titular group taking government office in these countries. So in Kazakhstan, 20% of the people who 20% of Kazakhs were likely to seek state assistance, where it was only 12% of non-Kazakhs, and it was comparable, actually more a bigger divide in Kyrgyzstan. So ethnic connections did play a role, but they're not the only type of connection that people draw on to try to get assistance.
This might have been touched on by a previous question.
Okay.
But the people that you interviewed, did they generally view the corruption that they engaged in as outright immoral, or that they more view that as business as usual?
I didn't get into discussions about morality. I don't think I ever used that language, or don't recall people using that language. But people were very clear that they didn't like that they had to do it. I guess people would use language like it being wrong, but mainly it was just a dislike of having to do it. And that's in part what led me to think about this idea of corruption as a last resort. So it's not that people were eager to do this. And interestingly, we see this, this has been documented for other cultures around the world. There have been field research done by anthropologists in Argentina and Nigeria, for example. It's really clear that people don't like that they have to do this, but it is business as usual, and I'm just trying to expand. It's business as usual after I look to see who else in society and in the market might be able to help me. Okay. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
And then there's a follow-up question. So
Yeah.
you sort of mentioned that they themselves termed it as corruption. I'm just curious in what language. Were they using the Russian word for corruption or the local word?
Yeah, I interviewed in Russian, except for that failed attempt at buttering people up in Uzbek. Other questions? Doug? Yeah, please.
So I wanted to, in a way, it kind of picks up with this question, business as usual. And it goes back to the questions about corruption and your use of that term, which I recognize you're being very careful to say you're using it because the people who wrote this term, you don't want to talk the language of morality, and I'm going to push you against the direction, and you're going to push back. And I understand that. But I think the part of Christian's question, which is relevant, is that that language is itself loaded.
Mhm.
And it probably has an inherent kind of moral weighting of right and wrong at some level for the people who are using it.
Mhm.
And so in a way this seems to me as much a story of Central Asians and potentially of other Soviet citizens too, in Russia, Ukraine, or wherever else. When they start talking about corruption, and then they talk about their own choices about how to act in the context of everyday necessities. I mean, they're also displaying for you the ways in which they've learned what that word means,
Mhm.
what sort of category. And they've learned where certain things can be presented in ways that have to be sort of, well, sin is not my choice, or I wish I didn't have to do this, because it has that kind of moral weight to it. So I guess the question is, yes, they talk about corruption, and you also were watching for them to do this whole range of things, like informal supports and
Mhm.
all this. Do the people with whom you're talking see like corruption, that category, as attached to this whole panoply of activities? Or within this sphere, are there things that for them are counting as social connectivity or just what you need to do to get through your life? And that's not really corruption. And of course I need to perform that I would not do whatever is corrupt, unless I had to. But this other stuff that I'm reporting to you and you can then analyze, for me, that's not also under this category of corruption, if that makes sense. Like where they're kind of drawing that line.
Mhm.
And to give that example, like I went to Central Asia for the first time, and I encountered this. I was living with a family,
Mhm.
and the family like figured out what are they going to do with this grad student from California? Like, what are they going to do with them?
Do they make money from you?
I mean, I paid them rent, and so in some sense,
No, I was
there
just
was
joking.
social capital that came
Yeah.
from me being there. And I went with my wife, and she taught English to kids in the neighborhood. So
Yeah.
there were actual tangible benefits. But I needed things too, and they knew that. And so they got me an affiliation with the Academy of Sciences by asking around. They weren't academics, but they pulled on all their strings.
Mhm.
And my host family's eldest son's best friend's grandmother, that's really what it was, had just retired from the Institute of History. And that's how I got to it informally.
Uh-huh.
No one saw that as wrong or inappropriate. There was no
Mhm.
moral judgment, and everyone was completely open about it. Of course, this is
Mhm.
what we do. I got to the institute, and one of the people working in the admin team there offered me access to secret party documents for a fee. He talked about this in his office, the door always closed in a hushed whisper. It was clear that there was a very different kind of proposed transaction.
Right.
That was not business as usual. So I guess what I'm wondering is how the people who are presenting this to you draw that line, and how
Mhm.
that line corresponds with the kind of category you're bringing into the mix.
Right. So let me preface the answer just by talking a little bit more about methods and procedure. So my starting point of conversations with average citizens, and it mirrored what I did in the survey too. It was, what are your problems? Whom do you turn to for assistance? It wasn't, what corrupt behaviors do you engage in, or, or do you give bribes? Do you use personal connections? Do you give promises of political support? So it was very much them leading me toward what they were doing, and then them characterizing that, by saying, I don't like that I had to do this, and then providing that story. Because as I said, this started out just as a project about coping, not about corruption. So again, I didn't talk to people a lot about meaning of terms. That wasn't a focus. But I would say that people would be more likely. So I think there are two dimensions in terms of applying the corruption label. One is, well, three dimensions. One is what is the practice, what technique are you using? One is who is the target of that attempt, and then what are you getting in return? So of the three, bribes and promises of support, like selling your vote or faking other people's votes, those would be viewed as the most corrupt. But there are times when personal connections can be viewed as corruption too. So, are you, first of all, are you dealing with a government official or not? And then what are you trying to get? Are you breaking the rules? Are you getting your credit application approved even though you're clearly not eligible for the rules? Or are you asking that your resume be looked at? Make sure my resume is actually carefully looked at among the hundreds, but you're still being evaluated. So yeah, so that's the best. It wasn't the focus of my research, but from my experience, that's the best I can glean. Okay. Okay.
I was actually wondering, when you said that some people would, in some countries, they said that they turn to government officials, and then in Uzbekistan they said that they turn to social, right?
They did turn to government officials too, but they characterized their interaction with the state in Uzbekistan as just receiving the goods and services. They didn't have to compete for them.
Okay.
It was just guaranteed.
So my question was, actually my interviews were very similar to yours,
Uh-huh.
and people said that in the socialist period they turned to this person, but that person was actually part of the factory, which was an employment.
Right.
But then even now they turn to the same person because of the relationship they have with them.
Oh, okay.
But now they're part of a different kind of institution, right?
Interesting.
So I was wondering if you saw any of that, which would, for them it's the same person, and their relationship kind of happens the same way, but what that person does for them might be more problematic now than it was before, or vice versa.
Yeah. That's really interesting to see if it's the same individuals who switched positions from the Soviet era. I can't, off the top of my head, I can't think of any of those cases. It seems like a lot of the people in power in the Soviet era are now the Oxicals, the Whitebeards, playing chess on the street corner. And there's been yeah, I mean, even the village leaders that I talked to were not in their positions in the Soviet era. And I can't think of any examples of someone leaving a state enterprise and being a government official at this point. But maybe really early in the independence period there was more of that. But it's interesting to think about, yeah. Something else I could have collected data on.
So we only have a few more minutes, but we have some graduate students. I don't know if some of you guys have anything you'd like to ask Dr. McMahon?
I have a quick question, actually.
Yeah.
I find this stuff very interesting. I think it was a great talk. I was wondering how, if you saw any observable evidence of kind of the legality issue of corruption being taken into account by people. Like, you talked about at the very beginning of your talk how there's clearly an effort by people to avoid this kind of corrupt activity if they can by going through these other veins. But what is the repercussions for being found to participate in corruption in these countries, and was there any effect that you could see this had on people, like fear of getting caught, I guess, almost?
No, I never heard anybody talk about the law. So there, people would talk about the anti-corruption efforts, like the big, like presidential-led or government-led anti-corruption efforts. Those were directed at grand corruption, right? So, and they generally haven't been genuine in post-Soviet Central Asia. They've been to make political rivals disappear. So people were very cynical about those efforts. But so people were, when they said they disliked, when they talked about disliking having to engage in the practice, it was more, I think it was more about morality, and it was not about fear of sanction. And people would talk about how it was really common to engage in these practices too. So yeah, not about the law, yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.